Hello and welcome to Noble Mind.
The Noble Mind podcast is brought to you by the Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy. Hello, I'm Alex Gukcha.
And I'm Dr. Kate King. We recorded this extended interview with Dr. Rick Hanson before the current COVID crisis. If you are interested in his thoughts on the topic and some guided meditations to help during these challenging times, you can check out his Be Resilient During Coronavirus page at rickhanson.net. In this episode, we talked to Rick about his new book, Neurodharma.
Rick Hanson is a psychologist, senior fellow of the Greater Good Science Center at UC Berkeley, and New York Times bestselling author. His books include Neurodharma, Resilient, Hardwiring Happiness, Buddha's Brain, and more. He's lectured at NASA, Google, Oxford, and Harvard, and taught in meditation centers worldwide. He began meditating in 1974 and is the founder of the Wellspring Institute for Neuroscience and Contemplative Wisdom.
You can get this episode's show notes at noblemindpodcast.com and follow us on social media at noblemindpodcast. We hope you enjoy the show. We are here with Rick Hanson. Thank you so much for joining us on Noble Mind today.
I'm really happy to be here. And honestly, I love the title, Noble Mind. And if I could just rant briefly about that, I mean, that's probably taken a little bit maybe from some of the early language in Buddhism. And as I bet you both know, the actual proper translation of the so-called Four Noble Truths is that these are truths of the noble ones. Uh-huh. And in that context of the Buddha, in which nobility was through deeds, not birth, socially radical for his time, I'm struck by the ways in which that which is noble within us attracts us to these deep truths. You know, why are these the truths of the noble ones? Well, partly because that which is noble within us is drawn to them, and that which is noble within us is cultivated through our engagement with these truths, thus truths of the noble ones. So may that be the case for all those who are engaging this Noble Mind podcast.
Well, thank you. It's certainly aspirational for us.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So not everybody will know about you or your work, so maybe we could just start by having you tell us a little bit about your background and what got you interested in meditation and mindfulness to begin with.
Oh, well, let's see, how much time do we have? Not too much, I hope. So I'm a clinical psychologist, a methods guy. I consume a lot of research, but I don't generate very much. I try to understand it, integrate it, and apply it. So I try to be scholarly about it without presuming more than that. So that's kind of my orientation. And I've been, I would say, for 2 decades easily, deeply interested in what could be considered the intersection of 3 circles. The circle of Western psychology, the circle of modern brain science, and the circle of contemplative wisdom. And of all the world's contemplative traditions, including secular ones, the one that I particularly know best is grounded in the early original teachings of the Buddha 2,500 years ago. And then certainly in Buddhism generally, as it's kind of spread throughout the world and branched like a mighty tree. So if you think of the intersection of those 3 domains, right? Psychology, neuroscience, and contemplative practice, there's just so much rich material there. It's so fascinating and wonderful. And I mark my own journey. I would say I'll call out 3 sort of fundamental transitions or points. One was when I was extremely young. In the background of my sense, a lot of my earliest memories is this wistful sense that there was much unnecessary unhappiness, that people didn't need to be so irritable, cranky, pressured, weird, mean, etc. I didn't know what to do about it, but that was very heartfelt for me as a little preschooler, honestly, in my earliest memories. Then second, in my mid-teens, I was miserable. I was socially awkward. I was painfully self-conscious. I was very unhappy. And it just seemed like I was trapped and it was getting worse. And then I suddenly kind of realized that I could always learn and grow a little every day, that the past was stuck, but the future was more hopeful, and then I could develop myself. And it was kind of on me to learn how to be a little more skillful in how I talked with kids at school, to learn how to not be so reactive to my parents, to learn to be a little more comfortable around girls, let's say. And I could learn. That's so hopeful. If I were to teach people one thing, if you were asked, okay, you could teach people one thing. What's your one thing? There's no right answer, but I can tell you my answer. I would teach them how to learn, because then you can learn anything. So I got deeply interested in the actual how of healing, learning, developing, growing, cultivating, the how of bhavana, to put it in, the Sanskrit term. That was a key point. And then late in college, on a whim, who knows where grace comes from, I just was inspired to study Eastern philosophy and religion. In my last quarter at UCLA, I took 12 units of independent study, dove deeply, and holy moly, the wheels really came off in a good way. And I began to meditate back in 1974. And I was a little lame. I was kind of sloppy about it. But there was something deeply true about it, that if we just slow down and pause and be with ourselves, we'd start learning a lot about ourselves. And also our relationship to ourselves starts to change as we be with it. And we're also more able to kind of settle into our natural home base, kind of calm, contented, warm-hearted wakefulness.
Great. And your new book is called Neurodharma, and it seems that one of your great contributions is bringing in that neuroscience and the brain into this conversation. And I'd love to hear a little bit about what you think that offers to people, in terms of having that brain level understanding, as we go into these practices.
Great question. So to be clear, until extremely recently, no one knew much about what was happening under the hood, right? To be clear, the Buddha and people in other traditions, and some we've known about and many we haven't known about, have gone far in practice without needing an MRI. All right. So I don't think neuroscience is necessary for practice, whether it's fairly light, casual practice, or whether you're going to go all the way in your own path of awakening. Mm-hmm. It's not necessary. On the other hand, mind, factually, is grounded in life. Mm-hmm. This moment of hearing, seeing, tasting, touching, wanting, liking, disliking, suffering, or enjoying is grounded in underlying physical processes in the body that are extended, of course, into nature and life and all the way back in deep time. Okay, that said, the primary location of the most immediate causes and conditions of this moment of experiencing, for better or worse, lives between the ears. And that's the extraordinary brain, with 85 billion or so neurons, another 100 billion or so support cells, neurons connected on average with thousands of other neurons each, giving us several hundred trillion synapses, little sparkling microprocessors in a vast network inside our own head. That, as Charles Sherrington, the neuroscientist, put it 100 years or so ago, the brain is like an enchanted loom, continually weaving, the tapestry of consciousness. So as we begin to understand how the loom works, we then can become more skillful with our own minds. As we begin to understand, for example, how ruminating about or marinating in stressful, irritable, exasperated, anxious experiences gradually sensitizes the alarm bell of the brain, the amygdala, we begin to understand better why it's important to not just marinate in those experiences and why it's important to be mindful of them, disidentified from them, stepping back like a kind of circuit breaker that interrupts the process of reinforcement. And that why is extremely useful, especially in a Western materialist culture, because people need to understand the why. And there's been no added value in terms of skillfulness in the example I'm giving, but there's definitely added value in the motivation. And motivation is fundamentally important, as we all know, whether it's with people in psychotherapy. They'll joke, how many therapists does it take to change a light bulb? Only one, but the light bulb has to want to change, right? How do we help people want to change in a positive, beneficial way, including the change that is the uncovering of the beautiful true nature that was always there. But still, it's a change of some kind that matters, a change that lasts. And also, if we appreciate that any kind of change that lasts involves durable shifts of neural structure and function. In other words, how does the process of cultivation and purification and training and the acquisition over time of greater trait mindfulness, trait compassion, trait resilience, how does that process occur? It must involve underlying changes of neural structure and function. That then takes us to some skillfulness things that actually add value, where you realize, wait a minute here, I need to engage my experiences deliberately, multiple times a day, to maximize their beneficial impact. And if I don't do that, those experiences of calming or happiness or compassion are momentarily good, useful, beneficial, but they have no lasting value. They don't make me any more compassionate or grateful or resilient the next day, right? We need to help beneficial experiences to sink in because the brain has a negativity bias. It's adapted to rapidly learning from painful, stressful experiences, particularly intense ones, but even mild ones. But it's not primed in that way to learn from our beneficial experiences. So we need to give the brain some help. And there are a variety of skillful ways to do that, each one of which has, studies behind it. But mostly it's just common sense. We know, for example, that the longer we stay with and a beneficial experience, the more likely we are to be affected by it, bit by bit. How long? Right? Residue by residue. It's a great question. There's no right answer. Few people studied this. Why don't more people study the fundamental how of positive change? So I'm like a guy banging a bell saying, hey, this is really important. Let's talk about it. Let's do more of it. So I've pulled together literature reviews of this material, but it is very interesting. How long is a threshold duration for the internalization of an experience of, let's say, compassion to increase trait compassion? The answer is that, of course, it's complicated. There's not much research here. A lot of it's on non-human animals. The takeaway, though, is the longer the better. Mm-hmm. My personal hunch is that there's a threshold of at least a couple seconds. Otherwise, it's just only held in extremely short-term memory buffers, and then it doesn't transfer. But my rule of thumb personally is give it a breath. That's half a dozen seconds for a typical person. Give it a breath. And if you want, give it 2 or 3. Why not? It's a good experience. So brain science is both motivating and it's useful. And I think it's foolish and honestly inconsistent with both the values of science and the values of Buddhism to turn away from what we are understanding increasingly about how, while we can experience mindfulness of the body, and there's good training about that. I actually taught about that last night in my sitting group. We are continuously body full of mind. It is the body that is making the mind. And appreciating the linkages in the mind-body process fills one with hope that there are things we can do every day to guide our minds and therefore our brains to a better place. Here, that's my rant.
Body full of the mind. Could you explain that?
Oh, yeah, totally. So mind is one of those words, can mean a lot of things. What do people mean by it? What I mean by it is the information represented by the nervous system. That's how I define mind. It's a naturalist kind of definition. It's grounded in science, and it is the essence, essentially, of how cognitive neuroscientists, psychologists, and other people talk about mental processes, mental operations, memory, knowledge, programs of various kinds, habit patterns of various kinds. At bottom, it's about information. So what's clear to us is that there is the hardware of the nervous system. It's also clear to us, to scientifically oriented people, that the nervous system's function is to process information. It moves information around like the cardiovascular system moves blood around. That's the fundamental purpose. That's why the nervous system evolved around 600 million years ago to exchange information between the sensory and the motor systems of primitive multicellular animals in the ancient seas, more or less these ancient jellyfish that needed to, have their sensory systems send messages to their motor systems like smells good, tastes good, swim forward. Smells horrible. Oh, this is freaky. Get out of here. You know what I mean? They had to communicate. So that's the function. So those two levels are clear. We have matter. We have the hardware, the nervous system embedded more broadly in the body altogether. I talk about the nervous system and the brain because that's where most of the action is, but I don't mean to diminish the role of the immune system and other parts of the body. Okay. So hardware is clear. Information processing is clear. And then it gets really interesting. How do the hardware and the information it's representing interact in such a way that there are experiences that humans are seeing and squirrels are seeing? Mice are smelling. Mice are remembering. Mice are wanting. Mice are fearing, even though their brains are basically less than an inch long. How's that happening? That's still something of a mystery, and I don't want to underestimate the complex issues embedded in what people call the hard problem of consciousness. That said, it's very clear in studies on humans and non-human animals that there are extremely high levels of correlations between our experiences, our consciousness, our phenomenology. There are very high level correlations between the experiences we are having and the information that is being processed by underlying physical processes. And that's how I understand all this stuff and so forth. I'm myself happy to stop at the water's edge of ordinary reality and to consider experiences. I prefer that term to consciousness because it's more down to earth and it's a more bounded word: hearing, seeing, wanting, hurting, enjoying, so forth. I'm happy to stay within ordinary reality. And I'm quite happy to consider the possibility, if not the actuality, of supernatural, if not transcendental matters. And so I'm perfectly comfortable with people who believe, if not even experience, that we must take into account some dimensions, aspects, something of consciousness for a full account, and aspects, dimensions, and so forth that move beyond ordinary reality. That said, there's plenty of good stuff to work with within ordinary physical universe, the Big Bang universe, and plenty of opportunities to use the mind to change the brain, to change the mind for the better.
Right. As you said, we're only just now starting to understand what's going on between the ears, let alone anything bigger or more difficult to assess or measure.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. I think of this phrase funny right now: an opportunistic humility.
That's good.
To be humble about what we don't know, and yet realize that we know more than nothing.
Right.
And if you have to know everything before you do anything, you'll never do anything at all. Mm-hmm. And that's where that, to me, opportunism comes in of let's try it, especially if the risks are low. You know, if someone is deeply vulnerable to psychotic breaks, very fragile in their character structure, okay, let's not have them do a 10-day intensive, rigorous, silent meditation retreat. All right, the risks are significant there. But for someone who's reading a little post in Mind Body Green, or listening to this podcast, or downloading a Tara Brach meditation, why not give it a whirl? Right. Inside the laboratory of your own mind-body process, and then see what happens. And if it's not good, turn it off. Don't do it again. It's okay. But otherwise, keep on going.
Right.
Your book, Neurodharma, goes together with a website and a course. How do you place Neurodharma, the book and the course, in the frame of the rest of your work, other books and courses?
Well, thank you. So it's my 6th book, and I kind of am stunned every time I look around and go, what?
6 is a lot.
I know. It's weird. Yeah. And I've got one more in me about relationships. I'll call it Just One Thing for Love. It relates to the Just One Thing book, which is about practices, 52 simple, down-to-earth practices. Just like, what's the thing you're sort of focused on today or this week? Just one thing. And then it'll be just one thing for relationships. So I've got one more left, But this book in particular, I've been reflecting on after I wrote it. And what I tried to do was, in a very respectful way, get at the deepest, essential themes in Buddhism, combined with fantastic cutting edge neuroscience and then apply it in the cultivation of 7 qualities, 7 ways of being that I see very developed in the great sages and teachers throughout history, including people that are not famous and yet are still deeply realized in our lives today. We see these 7 qualities in them, which I'll name in a moment, and we can also feel the beginnings of them or the intermediate stages of them in ourselves, and we can cultivate them further in what could be called a broad process of awakening. And I think of the pinnacle of human possibilities, the upper reaches of human potential, and as people get closer and closer to the, as it were, top of the mountain, through whatever route they take, they tend to converge on a certain way of being that you can recognize, whether it's a Sufi poet or a Buddhist monastic or a deeply trained secular humanist who's done a lot of mindfulness meditation retreats. They all kind of feel similar, right? And then we can work backwards in a wonderful, plausible form of reverse engineering to consider what is going on in their brains. And how can we use that information plausibly and respectfully in our own practices to cultivate those qualities in ourselves, increasingly hardwired into our own nervous systems? So that's what that's about. And I'll just name the 7 ways of being, 7 qualities that we do them as practices. We grow what we practice, and we practice what we grow. So steadiness of mind. So that's mindfulness, concentration, focus, and deeper states of meditation, such as moving toward the jhanas, the deep states. Second, warming the heart. It's the material of compassion, kindness, the social engagement system, the vagus nerve complex, and expanding the circle of us, given our very tribal and combative nature, to include more and more of them. Then third, there's resting in fullness. This is the material on equanimity that's so rich in Buddhism, finding a sense of contentment and enoughness already as the next moment arrives. Those are the first 3. They kind of hang together: steadiness, lovingness, and fullness. Then come the next 3, which also hang together, even if being a little more subtle. Being wholeness, a sense of feeling whole as a being, undivided, nothing left out, with a kind of non-dual sense of consciousness altogether as a whole, with many little sparkling pixels in it, with a deep feeling of simply being, not swept away by stressful doing. That's wholeness. And then comes nowness, receiving nowness. What does it really take in the brain to stay in the present moment? With a brain that's somewhat designed these days, especially to do mental time travel, to go into the future or the past, pretty saturated with a strong sense of I. How do we get out of that and come into the freshness of the arising moment, continuously updating consciousness by working the neural circuitry of those aspects of attention that are alerted and oriented to the next moment at kind of the front edge of the windshield of consciousness? That's receiving nowness. That's the 5th practice. And then 6th, opening into allness. What's going on with people who talk about feeling one with everything? The Dalai Lama with the hot dog vendor joke, right? Make me one with everything. And so what's happening in the brain when the boundaries start to soften? Not psychotically. Definitely what's happening in the brain during these unusual and yet oddly common experiences. About 1/3 of the people in the world report having had an extraordinary non-dual experience, or it's sometimes called self-transcendent experience. One of my friendly colleagues is David Yaden at Penn, who I think just got his PhD recently, who's done wonderful research on self-transcendent experiences. So what's happening when the sense of self just drops out? And second, very important, the sense of the world shines forth in radiant perfection. What's going on? And then how can we use what plausibly might be occurring then in everyday life to have more of a sense of feeling supported by the nature and the universe and culture altogether, and feeling like a local expression of everything, with the sense of separation falling away increasingly? How do you do that? That's great. Opening into allness. And then the last one is probably the most controversial, because I'm exploring in the last one, finding timelessness. What the Buddha called, is translated various ways, the unconditioned or unconditioned, unfabricated, unconstructed. What is he talking about? His deep analysis was that every vehicle he tried, whether it's privileged life as a well-to-do householder when he was young, family life, which he walked away from, that's a morally ambiguous fact, and then these deep ascetic, traditional meditative practices, wild stuff he did for half a dozen years after that. Still, after each one, he realized it's impermanent, it's transient, it's ultimately unreliable because it's conditioned. Everything that arises due to conditions passes away due to conditions. It's ultimately unreliable. So he searched for the ultimate reliable basis, which he found in what he called nirvana, the sense of the unconditioned. And it's controversial whether he's speaking there about something that's bounded within ordinary reality, with often a presumption that that's all there is, folks, and just deal with it. Or was he speaking to something genuinely transcendent, meaningfully distinct from ordinary reality, which includes a lot of extraordinary stuff like, quarks and, quantum entanglement and stuff like that. All right. So in my view, personally, I'm fine with people who want to stop within ordinary reality for various reasons, including they think that whatever's beyond ordinary reality is simply unknowable within ordinary reality, so it's not relevant for practice. Plus, it's full of lots of pitfalls having to do with credulous belief and sentimentalizing and hopefulness, let alone religious righteousness. Okay, I get that. That's a fair critique. That said, what did the Buddha actually teach? I think he actually taught about a unconditioned sphere, I'll use that word, that's hard to language within ordinary reality. So he described it through negation, the deathless, the undying, the unchanging, the unailing, the unstained, the unconditioned, the unfabricated. And beyond whatever the Buddha might have taught, what's true? And in my personal experience and reason to believe, there really is a transcendentally unconditioned something or other that, in addition to unconditioned possibility, may also have qualities of consciousness and benevolence, which others routinely experience or ascribe to the transcendental. And for me, it's a matter of respecting diversity, if nothing else, to include that possibility in one's practice, which is a very rich and central element, the transcendental, for many, many, many people. And simultaneously, I'm quite happy to respect people who just want to stop at the edge of ordinary reality and have a lifetime of practice opportunities right there. So that's what the book's about. And as you can tell, I'm just totally jazzed by it because I just think the material is so cool.
Right. Well, and we have had the great good fortune of seeing an advanced copy and getting to read it. So, and these 7 areas make up the majority of the book, walking through these 7 broad areas with tons of practices to help people touch into each of these things, which is really such a great offering for people as they sort of read it, to really get to touch into some practices that give an experiential sense of each one.
Yeah.
So I guess my question is, there's a lot to unpack there. There's a whole book's worth and a whole online course worth. Which one or ones of these do you feel like make for a good kind of starting line?
Well, all 7 of these work together. You can see that. That said, we practice in time, even if there is timelessness. We grow and change and heal in time. So we have to put one foot in front of the other foot to walk. So I do think that there's a natural sequence, the 7 that I laid out, including over the course of a single meditation. Actually, during a single meditation, particularly a longer one, 20, 45 minutes, you can just start by steadying your mind, establishing a stability of presence, including a loving quality of warm-heartedness, then establishing a kind of sense of contentment. It's okay already. It'd be nice to have more, but you're really okay. And then you start moving into the deep end of the pool with wholeness and nowness and allness, and then even a sense of maybe unconditioned possibility, always just prior to this moment of actuality. And beyond that, or in addition to that, a sense perhaps of spaciousness or stillness, maybe even an underlying deep, deep consciousness that in some ways doesn't feel like it's entirely your own, timelessness. So that's a natural flow. And you can also see over the course of a person's practice, especially if we're teaching people from the beginning, we tend to establish the first three. They kind of go together. Sometimes people start with warm-heartedness. I think warm-heartedness is a natural start, actually, because if you don't have that fundamental warm-hearted feeling for yourself with a related sense that's more muscular, kind of a scruffy determination to not be miserable all the time, right? Or such a jerk all the time. I can relate to both of those. So anyway, so I think there's a natural flow there, but I think it's also very important to realize that these are not reserved, these seven are not reserved for the chosen few. They're accessible to all of us. They are in our nature when we're not rattled and disturbed. Most people can fairly readily identify a sense of each one of these, certainly the first six, if not the seventh as well. And I think it's really important in a value structure to both be inviting and welcoming and helpful for people at the very beginning. A motivated beginner, really wonderful. Such sincerity, such respect I have for that person who says, I don't get it. Help me understand what's good here, what's useful here. All right, that's great. Well, at the same time, I think a lot of people honestly kind of stall out at the intermediate stage. It's cool, it's great. I've been there many times in my life, and yet, wow, all the great teachers, honestly, they accept it and they encourage, if not exhort, those who are doing pretty well, but are sort of hanging out at a plateau to keep on going. And that's why I think it's very important to dust off our sense, which is aspirational, which I find noble. One of the qualities of the noble ones is aspiration, and our aspirations ennoble us along the way. So I think it's important to dust off the aspiration of full awakening or movement very far in that direction. I'm very affected by this quotation from Suzuki Roshi, the Zen master. He said, I don't know if there are enlightened beings. I am sure that there are enlightened moments.
Mm-hmm.
And we can string more and more of those enlightened moments together and also weave them more kind of into the wallpaper of the mind, the background atmosphere of our own consciousness, and have them become increasingly these qualities, these seven qualities, present in us continuously. And I think that A, that's what we see in people who are farther along, and B, that's what we see in ourselves as we develop.
So you make this paradoxical point that these seven ways of being are both things that we aspire toward and move toward gradually, and at the same time, they're already at the core of who we are.
Yeah.
Would you say a few things about that?
You're getting at the classic issue, which you see in the tension, even in the Theravada and the Mahayana threads in the history of Buddhism. This great question. So much about it. And I think it's really important. I love the Tibetan saying, gradual cultivation, sudden awakening, gradual cultivation, or related saying, moments of awakening many times a day. Or Suzuki Roshi's quote, again, Suzuki Roshi, you're perfect as you are, and you could use some improvement. That's a really good one. And I like Milarepa's line in Stephen Batchelor's translation of some of his work. As he was reflecting on his life, he said, in the beginning, nothing came. In the middle, nothing stayed. In the end, nothing left.
Mm.
And so we have, on the one hand, a recognition of the fact of development over time. There is change over time. And what's really quite remarkable is to explore the intersection of impermanence, radical transience, and Nietzsche, and Pali, with bhavana, the fact that we do cultivate. And we can have negative bhavana. We can cultivate crankiness and addiction. And, as therapists, we know there's a lot of negative stuff can be cultivated. Additionally, there can be positive things. So we have these two things going together that are true: radical impermanence and durable change. Really remarkable. How do we engage both? How do we respect transience while gently, with that kind of humble opportunism and intimacy with our own experience, help ourselves receive whatever are the beneficial residues of this moment of practice, this moment of experience, this conversation with our friend, this realization while reading a little passage in a book, whatever it is. How do we help that kind of land and sink in and take root? And then gradually, bear flowers and fruit. So to me, that's a fundamental fact on the one hand. On the other hand, it's also true that when people are undisturbed, when they're not rattled, when they're not frightened, when they're not frustrated, when they're not wounded, when they haven't been abandoned, they come home to a really good place and can speak about a fundamental sense of well-being, which for me has these three essential qualities of peace, contentment, and love, having to do with the sense of needs met, which is necessary in the core for there to be well-being, an enoughness of needs met in one's core. Even if we're on the edges, there's a lot of trouble. And even more deeply, many people report that there's a continuity of awareness that is deeply reliable. We can take refuge in and abide as it. And people also report a sense of being lived potentially by a love that's not entirely their own. They speak about these things. And so for me, these are both true. And they serve each other. Through gradual cultivation, we become more accessible to sudden awakenings. We become more able to dwell in, think about the word vihara, the dwelling places, the Brahma viharas of compassion, kindness, equanimity, and a generous joy, generous happiness for the welfare of others. We can dwell more there. To go the other way, to know that your deep nature is innately awake, aware, well-wishing, and contented is a fantastic refuge while you're engaging the practice as a gradual cultivation. So to me, the two serve each other. Each one has pitfalls. People get caught up, as I have, in cultivate, practice, can be very goal-directed and kind of get burned out along the way. Flip the other way. People who just say, oh, just drop into your true nature. It's all non-dual. Just go. Just be there. I'm like, great if you can hang out there for more than a second, right? But often the people who teach that have done 30 years of gradual cultivation practice on the basis of which they say, just drop in. And so I think just because both have pitfalls doesn't mean we don't do both. It just means we avoid falling in the pit and then integrate, gradual cultivation and sudden awakening, true nature and durable change. We integrate those together on the path.
So the three fundamental needs you talk about of safety, satisfaction, and connection.
Yeah.
I was watching your interview with Paul Gilbert. He talks about the three emotional systems. Do those correspond?
Yeah, very good. Keep going. I love this.
So are you thinking that the attachment and soothing system is more fundamental than the threat system and the drive system?
This is great. So kind of setting the table here. Paul and I think in terms of three fundamental needs: safety, satisfaction, and connection. And this is a fundamental model that's widely used in psychology and biology, right? Now, first point, I think it's very important to make sure we include connection because that's often left out. And it may not be just coincidental that most of the people who've developed these psychologies and philosophies, including in the Buddhist tradition, are men. And that might be part of why there's basically mainly a focus on just pain and pleasure. Pain is an indicator of a threat to safety, and pleasure an indicator of an opportunity for satisfaction. All right. But I think there's more to life than just avoiding pain and approaching pleasure. I think we're profoundly social. And we also need connection, which we pursue through attaching to others. So as a fundamental framework, we have avoiding, approaching, and attaching. As a detail in Buddhist psychology in terms of the hedonic tones of experience, sometimes translated the Vedanas in Pali as the feeling tones, even though they're not about emotion per se. The feeling tones, classically, as you know, are unpleasant, pleasant, and neutral. And in my view, unpleasant signals a need for safety, pleasant signals an opportunity for satisfaction, neutral just sort of says, keep on going, But what signals our need for connection?
Mm-hmm.
Biologically, neuropsychologically. And I think that there is an emergent in our evolution, fourth Vedana, a fourth feeling tone that with mindfulness, we can become more and more aware of, the sense of relatedness, whatever word we might use. And you can just recognize it. If you're aware of what's neutral, then leave that out. You get a sense of, okay, this is unpleasant, this is pleasant, and this is relational. And you can feel that you can distinguish between unpleasant and pleasant and locate relational and then see what comes of it. Okay, so that's kind of a framework. 3 needs, 3 fundamental operating systems, very, very broadly defined in the brain: avoiding, approaching, attaching, loosely related to the 3-stage evolution of the physical brain in its first reptilian brainstem stage, then mammalian subcortex stage, primate human neocortex stage, which are loosely but significantly related to our avoiding pain, avoiding threat, approaching reward, and attaching to others in order. Okay, that's a structure. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Do stressors mean we must be stressed? No. I think it's quite striking and very consistent with the Buddhist deep teaching that we can engage life fully. We can manage threats to safety. We can manage opportunities for reward. We can manage the complex relationships we have with others without being bothered by it, without an invasive, penetrating sense of upset that leads to craving, that leads to, in Pali, tanha, whose root meaning is thirst. In other words, a deficit state, a disturbance state. Craving, in the second noble truth, is a drive state in a neurobiological framework. It's a drive state. Why do animals, including us, move into drive states? Something's missing. Something's wrong, right? On the other hand, if we cultivate equanimity, that's why that sense of fullness is so deeply, deeply important. As we cultivate this core of mindfulness, access to our true nature, increasing sense of equanimity hardwired into our nervous, frantic, freaked out bodies, as we do that more and more, we're able to handle threats to safety, satisfaction, and connection without going into the red zone of reactive craving. That's really remarkable, right? And so in my view, just because the threat system is active doesn't necessarily mean we need to drop into craving and suffering as a result. An example for me is common is I've done a lot of rock climbing, especially back in the day. And I've had many experiences where, the safety issues were huge. It was, you mess up, you fall a long way. You're going to get hurt. And yet I was having a great time because I knew what I was doing. I was resourced. There was a calm strength in the core of my being with some anxiety around the edges, while still dealing with the threat issues. So in my view, therefore, in effect, there are 2 settings for each system. There are 2 settings for the avoiding system, 2 settings for the approaching system, 2 settings for the attaching system, red and green. And I think that it's overly simplistic to think that those 3 systems have only 1 setting each. And I think that it's simplistic to think that the threat system, the avoiding system, is inherently red, while the approaching system, is kind of ambiguous. And then the attaching system, sometimes called the soothing system, social soothing, although there are other ways to soothe oneself that do not involve relationships or the internalized sense of relationships, that soothing system is always green. No, there's a lot of neurotic craziness in attaching to others. Think about borderline personality structure, think about insecure attachment. Just think about, stalkers that were very caught up in a desire to attach, but do so in horrible, creepy ways. Just because we're attaching doesn't necessarily mean that there's wisdom and wholesomeness about it. So anyway, that's the framework I use. I disagree with Paul a little about this, while having profound respect for his work on compassion-focused therapy and other kinds of things. And I find this way of looking at it that I'm talking about, how to stay in the green zone when needs are challenged, is super hopeful for householders. And it's very aspirational. And it gets really interesting. I love this quote. I'm quoting a lot of people here, I guess, from Gil Fronsdal. He was talking about this as a kind of homage to U Pandita, and what he learned from U Pandita. And what Gil said, I've thought about many times. He said, the purpose of Buddhist practice is to expand the range of experiences in which we are free. Mm. And we could extend that to any kind of practice. It's easy to be in the green zone when you're sitting in a hammock and everything is going great. How do you stay in the green zone when your teenager's arguing with you? How do you stay in the green zone when your back hurts? How do you stay in the green zone when you're watching recently, let's say, the Democratic debate in the primary and you're pulling your hair out and ranting at the TV? How do you do that? That's the question. How do you stay in the green zone when you walk through a candy store or a liquor store and know that you just should not get any? So for me, that's super duper hopeful. And I find from a practical standpoint, for me, there are 3 takeaways for practice. One is when you're in the red zone, which is normal, we're designed to get upset about stuff. Things happen. Move out of it as soon as you can. Don't fight it. Don't resist it. Don't suppress it. Don't try to look on the bright side. It is what it is. Move into mindfulness as fast as you can. Disidentify from it. That reduces the reinforcing of it. And, move out of it soon. Don't ruminate about it. Don't feed the beast. Move out of it. Second key takeaway, cultivate psychological resources that help you manage your needs sufficiently so that you don't feel overwhelmed by them, which moves us into craving and suffering. In other words, cultivate resources to help yourself be safe and feel safe, like calm strength, or being able to relax at will, or appraising threats realistically and not exaggerating them. Cultivate these things in yourself. And skills with other people, being able to problem solve and work through threats, including healthcare threats as you get older. So that's a second key takeaway. Cultivate resources, inner strengths, classic process strengths of various kinds, including identified spiritual strengths. And third takeaway, marinate in the green. When you have an opportunity authentically, many times a day, usually in mild and still genuine ways, to feel a sufficiency of needs met. In this moment, you're basically all right now, right? In this moment, you've eaten enough. You're okay. You can feel contented. Nice to have more, already contented. Or in this moment, like right now, there's a really nice sense of camaraderie here. Why not feel it? You're walking down the street, or you get a coffee, somebody jokes with you, you're at work, you both roll your eyes when your boss walks out of the room, like, whoa. When there's a sense of connection with each other. It's great. Slow down, take it in, feel that needs are met. So you gradually build up an unshakable core inside, somatically, experientially, that with a sufficiency of needs met already, so that when the next challenge lands, it lands on an increasingly unshakable core of resilient well-being. So for me, those are 3 very practical takeaways that come out of this framework that I appreciate you asking me about here.
In terms of marinating in the good, you repeatedly come back to the 4-step heal process of have, enrich, absorb, and link.
Yeah.
So the first way of being you address is steadying the mind. And before I read that chapter, I was thinking that you would probably address concentration practices like shamatha. But I was struck by the fact that there is a lot of the heal process in the chapter to build qualities to stabilize one's attention.
Oh, yeah. So, for people in general, shamatha, concentration, right, practices of different kinds, and we become increasingly concentrated in the qualities we're developing. Is that what you're saying there? Yeah, exactly right. So you're getting at, to me, this fundamental matter that was summarized, when I asked myself the question we can all ask ourselves, if you could teach people one thing, what would you teach? I would teach how, the how of learning, because then it's the strength of strengths. It's what we use to develop the rest of them. So it's really quite striking that while we understand that it's useful in elementary school to teach fourth graders some things they can do inside their own mind when they're trying to memorize a list or remember, math equations or formulas or other kinds of things. We're teaching them to learn academic material. We don't usually at all teach people how to acquire social emotional learning, including attitudinal, somatic, spiritual learning. How do we actually do it? And I think that's a huge failure. It's a huge missing piece. Maybe roughly, whether it's an MBSR program, mindfulness-based stress reduction, or a meditation retreat, psychotherapy, or informal forms of self-help, personal development, ballpark, about a third of the people typically seem to get something significant for themselves, while half to a third don't really get much, if anything at all, or very rapidly return to their prior baseline. They went through it. They invested in whatever the intervention is. We invested in it, whatever we do as teachers or institutions. And yet the efficacy is nil for roughly half the people. And that's a routine finding. And so while there might be incidental learning, I'm using learning very broadly, not just about the multiplication tables, there might be incidental learning for some people who build resources through, let's say, emotionally positive experiences and so forth. And that's great. And I bet the three of us are in that super learner group. We learn a lot from what we do. We're through both biological nature and also some training. All right. But what about the other people? Why don't we develop a theory of social emotional learning and tend to teach people how to do it inside their own minds along the way? So that's been deeply interesting for me and what I've tried to contribute. Some well-developed comprehensive approach that summarizes neurologically plausible factors that people can engage in their minds while they're having the experiences they hope to convert from states to traits. Mm-hmm. There's state shamatha. People can do practices where they, in that meditation period or during that workshop or retreat, they're quite concentrated. And yet it's as if they have to start all over again the next time they engage that practice. On the other hand, some people develop greater trait shamatha that they can bring to bear in everyday life, and or they can return to it really quite readily through their training. So that's led me to what I call the HEAL process. That's what you've asked me about. That acronym really summarizes it, and I'll just walk through it super briefly. And it's very practical. It begins, so the HEAL stands for have, enrich, absorb, and link. The first word, have, refers to the first of the two necessary and sufficient stages of learning. Experience what you want to grow, either because it's already happening or because you're deliberately trying to create it, like doing a shamatha practice to cultivate shamatha in the moment. Great. Now you're having that experience. You're walking down the street, you look out, the lights bouncing off the glass of the windows is kind of neat. You're happy. Feel it. You're having that experience. Okay. If you want to have any kind of lasting value from it, though, that experience must be converted into a physical change in the brain. It must be, in my techie lingo, installed. We must internalize it. We must receive it into ourselves. How do we actually do that? I think there are two major ways to do that. I call them enriching and absorbing. They're experientially and objectively distinct from each other. In enriching, essentially, we help the experience last. We help it be big. We maybe bring a sense of novelty to it, which turbocharges the learning process. Maybe we really feel it in our bodies. We enrich it as an experience. Yum, 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 yum. And to be clear, many, many, many of the experiences that we are trying to internalize are not particularly pleasurable or emotionally positive, and yet they're very meaningful. A sense of gritty strength, scruffy durability, a sense morally of your entitlement to fair treatment in your family, just like everyone else. A sense of healthy remorse, a wince of like, I don't want to be like that the next time. I want to really get it, so I just don't go there the next time, right? So I want to be clear, I'm not just talking about smelling the flowers. That's a trivialization of this profound process of helping ourselves become a little wiser, a little stronger, a little more loving, a little more virtuous every day. All right. So enriching. And then absorbing means essentially sensitizing the memory-making machinery of the brain so that this big enriched experience is turbocharged in its conversion into a lasting physical change in the body. And there are different ways to absorb. One of the ones that I love is to focus on what's rewarding about the experience, what feels good about it or meaningful about it, because that increases dopamine and norepinephrine activity in the brain, which sensitizes the brain to the experience it's having at the time for internalization. So that's have, enrich, and absorb. It's like a fire. Have fire, light it or notice it. Second, protect the fire, enrich it, and add fuel to it. Now it's a big fire. Third, absorb. Lean into the warmth of the fire and take it into yourself. That's the necessary and sufficient summary of the fundamental how of self-directed brain change from the inside out during the experiences that we're having. Sounds complicated. I'm laying out different aspects of it. The essence is simple. Have it, enjoy it. Have experiences, help yourself have them. Why not? And enjoy them. Because in part, as we enjoy and internalize our wholesome experiences, we crave less. Cultivation undoes craving as we gradually fill ourselves up over time. And then last, L stands for link. It's the optional step of linking positive and negative material. This is a very common method in psychotherapy. It's actually baked into mindfulness practice, in which, let's say we're mindful of physical pain or mindful of emotional pain. That's the negative material. Okay, we'll just call it that. While we're surrounding it with spacious awareness. To use a metaphor you're familiar with probably, our pain is like salt. So if you take a teaspoon of salt, put it in a cup of water, stir it up, drink it, tastes terrible. But if you take the same amount of pain, the same amount of salt, and you put it in a big, clean bucket of water, and then you take a cup and drink it, you'll hardly notice it at all. That large bucket is like the space of awareness in which the pain of the salt is much more bearable, right? That's a form of linking right there. Compassion is linking. You feel the suffering, you suffer with, compatio, right? Including your own suffering and self-compassion, with the wish that suffering be relieved, typically with a warm-hearted feeling, maybe a movement to help if one can. That's linking too. It sounds exotic, but we do it routinely. You do it skillfully. You want to make sure that the positive is bigger. It's more in the foreground of your awareness. The negative is off to the side. And if you get hijacked by the negative, drop it. You don't want to reinforce it. Go back to the positive, reestablish yourself there, dwell there, take refuge there. And then if you want, bring the negative back. A simple example for me to finish is as a kid who was ignored and left out and miserable a lot, very young going through school and other issues too. I entered adulthood or college at least with a huge hole in my heart, just did not get enough social supplies that were internalized growing up, like a very thin soup. So I went looking for those beneficial moments that were real, of being included, seen, appreciated, liked, even cherished and loved. And when I felt them, I would really take them in. And occasionally, while really marinating in a strong sense of the positive, of kids on my dorm floor inviting me to go out for pizza, like, what? I exist? You saw me? Pizza? What? Sure. I'm marinating in that thing. While off to the side, little Ricky is lonely. I'm left out, unloved, feels like bad, off to the side. And I could feel that the positive, wholesome experience was making contact with that understandable. It's not bad material, but it's painful. It's suffering. It's afflictive, which is gradually making contact with that quote unquote negative material. And repeatedly, neurons that fire together, wire together, in the famous saying, repeatedly associating positive to negative, which is a familiar paradigm in behaviorism and other forms of psychotherapy and so forth, gradually eased and soothed and even replaced the negative so that it just didn't come up as much over time. It became genuinely relieved and replaced. It's like using flowers in the garden of the mind to crowd out and then eventually uproot and replace the weeds.
So the initial firing might be that feeling of loneliness or sadness, or having not had enough social connection. And then if you bring into your awareness that sense of connection that you have now, then that over time, that would gradually start to override or replace that initial
Yeah, that's a common sequence. We start with the negative. Minimally, we hold it in spacious awareness. We be with it. If we want, if it's skillful means, then we can bring in the positive, not to deny, as certainly you know, or suppress the negative, but to bring a caring to it, a helpfulness to it, and to not be inert and defeated. Yet again, I feel this way. Okay. Inside your own mind. Exactly.
I'm intrigued by something, well, a bunch of things in the book, but one of the things is you write many of our experiences proceed in ways that are causally independent of the underlying physical substrates that represent them. The mind has a causal power of its own.
Yeah. Well, I love, Alex, how you're just going at it. Like, what is the mind, Rick? What do you mean this? And I love, as a writer, obviously, you just love when people read your stuff. It's great. All right. So I'm using mind in a naturalist sense here inside ordinary reality. I'm not talking about cosmic consciousness or influences of supernatural factors. Okay. Pure cognitive neuroscience. There's a lot of debate about being reductionistic when we bring brain science into psychology. And one of the arguments, which I think is a straw man argument, frankly, one of the arguments is that those who do so are being reductionistic, mechanistic, materialistic, and so forth. And so first, I think it's helpful to kind of bound the topic by saying we're talking here entirely within the natural frame of ordinary reality, still full of mysteries. What is dark energy anyway, even if it's 2/3 roughly of the universe? We have no idea what it is. Whoa. Okay. So we're inside natural reality. Okay. Now, if you think about it, in this conversation, you asked me a question, teed it up, right? And to respond to that question, there are these cascades of information, as it were, moving through my nervous system. As I think about your question, I translate its meaning. I very rapidly sequence a kind of answer I want to offer and then move through that sequence while dealing with the fact that you're nodding some of the time or staring at me in horror at other times. No, really, you don't do it. You don't do it. Just nodding along the way. All that's happening. Well, what is the neural basis for those information flows that underlie the flows of experience? Well, that neural basis is like a whiteboard. It can represent anything. We're talking about the association cortices that are major features of the neural substrates of consciousness. We're talking about the upper outer regions of the frontal cortex that support working memory. We're talking about other circuitry in the brain that can support any kind of experience flowing through it. It's a very important point. So whether I was working through a geometry proof in high school or reading a book so that the information that's being represented by the squiggles of letters on the page are carrying me along, or right now in the flow of this conversation, or someone balancing their checkbook, those flows of information that underlie the flows of experiences were happening are independent in their information flowing. They're independent of the neural substrates that represent them, much as the meanings of a poem that has a progression to it, has a causal force to it, or working through a math proof on the whiteboard, or a dialogue between two people that we're imagining on the whiteboard. An argument dialogue goes this way, a positive outcome dialogue about a conflict goes that way, right? Those flows of meaning, logic, conclusion, rhythm, humor, misunderstanding, understanding, those flows of meaning are independent of the physical characteristics of the whiteboard, as long as it can represent information at all. And in that sense, it's quite powerful to appreciate that in a way that I think the Buddha would have really appreciated, mutually dependent origination in a very complex kind of way, that the physical substrates of the brain and the body broadly in life constrain and condition and enable the flows of information that underlie flows of experience. To be sure, it has its causal impact. While also it's true that many of our experiences, many of our particularly thought processes, including interactively with others, have a causal force of their own that is independent of the physical characteristics of the systems that represent those information flows. It's really important. And what happens along the way, which is really remarkable, is that the causal flows of information and experience enlist underlying neural activity for their representation and their registration. In other words, those flows of information and experience can often leave lasting traces behind in neural structure, which then shape other information flows and flows of experience in the future. The mind, as Dan Siegel puts it, uses the brain to make the mind. Mind flows of mental activity enlist flows of neural activity to then shape future flows of mental activity in a wonderfully interdependent kind of way. Technically, I avoided philosophy classes in college. I wanted to protect my GPA. So I'm a late learner here. I've come to appreciate, but there's this term called dual aspect monism. I learned it. It's a fancy term. It just simply means the notion that the way I think of it is that the mind and matter process, nama and rupa together, co-occur, and causes and factors flow back and forth between them. And fundamentally, they are two definitely distinct aspects. Information is immaterial. It's intangible. Experiences are really immaterial. They are intangible. Experiences don't have a location, but their causes have a location. Their material bases have a location. And so for me, dual aspect monism is two categorically and meaningfully distinct things: material matter and immaterial mind, which I define as information, most of which is outside of awareness. They co-occur as two meaningfully distinct aspects of a single coherent unified process. And that's a happy maker to me. And it's a way to respect the body and to be humble enough to realize we are not ghosts in a machine. We are integrated. We are an integrated mind-body person process. An eddy, patterning, mind and matter that has some continuity over time that occurs due to countless causes and eventually disperses when those causes change over time. That's who we are. And for me, it's deeply respectful and awestruck with gratitude to appreciate the actually embodied basis of our existence, while at the same time appreciating a fundamental freedom and existential responsibility for shaping the flows of experience, which means flows of information, as best we can.
Thank you so much, Rick. Gratitude, appreciation, and existential responsibility. Feels like a good place to maybe end.
Oh, yeah, just no big deal.
Drop the mic.
Drop the mic. As apparently the Buddha put it, or someone really wise put it in the Dhammapada, to quote the proverb, think not lightly of good, saying it will not come to me. Drop by drop is the water pot filled. Likewise, the wise one gathering it little by little, fills oneself with good. And that's our opportunity every day. One drop at a time, one breath at a time, one event with another person at a time, one synapse at a time, to fill ourselves with good for our own sake and that of all other beings.
Thank you so much.
Many thanks.
My deep pleasure. And thank you all. Blessings to you. Yeah.
And for people who are stimulated by this and want more, your Neurodharma book is coming out. And where else can people engage with you, your work, your writing, your teachings?
Oh, thank you. My website is a great place to go. It's a central hub, rickhanson.net, S-O-N, Rick Hanson, full of freely offered resources. Also, I've got some great online programs. They're very well priced. And we love giving out scholarships to people with significant financial needs. So those programs people can check out. They range from very substantial ones, the Foundations of Wellbeing, which we think of as taking about an hour a week over the course of a year to develop 12 fundamental psychological resources, 12 fundamental strengths, including mindfulness itself, for example. Then I have other programs at the other end of the spectrum. One's called Just 1 Minute, which is 57 super short little videos that are all less than 2 minutes with some related resource material, any one of which you can engage over the course of the day. Very, very, very bite-sized. And in that mix, we have the Neurodharma online program that's based on a 10-day meditation retreat I taught through this material. And I was pretty inspired. The group was wonderful. There were fantastic questions that emerged. I did a lot of extra little interviews and bonus material. And that program, the Neurodharma online program, is a great companion to the book and vice versa. And I really encourage people to check it out.
Excellent. Thank you so much again, Rick. We really appreciate your time
today. Thank you so much.
Oh, what a pleasure. Thank you both.
Thanks for listening today. This podcast was brought to you by the Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy, a nonprofit organization dedicated to the integration of mindfulness, meditation, and psychotherapy. For more information, visit meditationandpsychotherapy.org